Hi, geometry. Let's take a look at this equation right here, which is called a quadratic equation. Okay, you need a squared, or a 2 is your highest exponent on your variable, and you definitely want to get this equal to 0 to see it in this standard form right there. Okay, depending on the numbers a, b, and c, because remember they are numbers, you have one of these 4 methods on how to solve that. Now this video is only going to focus on options 1 and 2. Okay, 3 and 4 are separate videos. Feel free to view them at a later time. Okay, I'm going to go to the square root method first because I think it's easiest. So if I have something that looks like this, how do I know if the square root method is even an option? So in order for the square root method to work, this term right here can't be there. Okay, it could say something like 3x squared plus 5 equals 0. 10x squared minus 2 equals 0. But this b value has to be 0, and this term has to drop out. So we don't want to see that term in there. Okay, so here's a perfect example. It's perfect for the square root method. There's no 5x or 2x or 10x in the middle. It's just x squared and the constant. So how do we go ahead and solve it? Think back to how we solve linear equations. We want to get x by itself. So the first step, think of undoing your PEMDAS. We're going to add this 12 to the other side. Okay, once that's done, I'm left with x squared equals 12. So now I have to decide, well, how do I get x by itself? How do I undo squaring something? Okay, to undo the squaring, I'm going to square root both sides. Now remember, when you square root both sides, the square root was not originally in the problem. Therefore, do not forget your plus or minus. Hopefully you remember that from Algebra 1. Okay, if this exponent right here is a 2, then you should have 2 solutions here. So if you forget the plus or minus, you only have the square root of 12. That's only one solution. Positive square root of 12 and negative square root of 12, those are your answers. So now, depending on what math class you are in, okay, what level of geometry, depends on how they want you to write your answer. You might just leave it as plus or minus the square root of 12. You might put it in your calculator and get the decimal. You might break it down using what we've learned in a different video on how to simplify the square root of 12. So as you can see, how you write the answer depends on your teacher, but this video is more focused on how do you solve using the square root method. Okay, new example. So if you're feeling confident on the square root method, go ahead, pause the video, and try this one out. Okay, so let's see how you did. Did you end up with plus or minus the square root of 2? Or possibly plus or minus 1.41, okay, depending on how you write the answer. Here's why I kind of like this example, because I wanted to show you one where it wasn't equal to 0 to start with, and it wasn't important to get it equal to 0. There's no reason to bring the 11 over here and get the 8 over here just to move it back to the right side. So again, x squared's on the left side. I started step by step. I started moving everything over to the right side. So first it was the 3, then I divided the 4 over. Then I square rooted both sides. So it wasn't quite written in our standard form, but it was still a candidate for the square root method. Okay, so let's switch it up and let's get into the quadratic formula. So maybe you remember this from Algebra 1, maybe you don't. Maybe you sing the cute little song to help you remember it. Maybe you have no idea what I'm talking about, but either way, here's the formula. Okay, the nice thing about the quadratic formula is there's no restrictions on what this equation must include or must not include in order for the quadratic formula to work. In other words, the quadratic formula works on every single quadratic out there. The only thing to keep in mind is that your quadratic equation must be equal to 0 in order for this formula to work. Time to try an example. So here's my example, but as you can see, I tried to pull out my a value. A sits in front of the x squared, b sits in front of the x, and c is my constant, so is c2. But hey, wait a minute, my equation's not equal to 0. So is c2? Is it 1? Is it some combination of them? Okay, in order to find my c value, I have to get this equation equal to 0. So I'm going to have to subtract the 1 over as my very first step. Okay, so now that I've moved the 1 over, you can see that I've got a c value of 1. Now my equation's equal to 0, and I'm ready to apply the quadratic formula. So I'm literally going to take these numbers and plug them in everywhere in the formula that calls for them. Okay, so I went ahead and plugged in the numbers. I got this, and I did a little bit of simplifying. 5 squared is where I got this 25. 2 times 3, that's where I got this 6. Now this is always the part that I think people get wrong. So I took a look at this right here, 4 times 3 times 1, and that's how I came up with that 12. Right there. Okay, so cleaning it up from here, I got to this, and then the only thing I did from here to here was underneath the square root, I subtracted 25 minus 12, and that's where the 13 came from. So again, depending on your teacher, are you going to leave your answer with the square root in it and the fraction in it, or are you plugging this into your calculator and going ahead and getting those decimals? So as I was wrapping up this video, I thought it might be nice to take a look at one equation and let's solve it with 3 different methods. Now we haven't talked factoring in this video, but there is a whole nother video on it. And I just wanted to show you that sometimes, depending on how the equation looks, you really get a choice. So you get to make the choice on what you like best. For this equation, all 3 of these methods are going to work. I'm going to work them all out, and then you can look at them and decide what do you like best. So here are all 3 options, all worked out. Square root method, I get plus or minus 3. The quadratic formula, I get plus or minus 3. And factoring, I get plus or minus 3. So obviously I'm going to get the same answer if I solve the same equation, but you can see all 3 methods truly do work. So for some quadratic equations, again, it depends on what's given. For some, you have multiple methods that you can choose from, and it's a personal choice. What do you like best? On some, you might not have any choices. The quadratic formula might be the only option you've got. I think it's kind of nice to know all your different options, okay? Know how the square root method works, know how the quadratic formula works, watch the factoring video if you need it, and know how to solve a quadratic by factoring. Know all of your options, and then you can choose the fastest, most efficient method for every quadratic equation you come across.